Welcome. Welcome, everyone. I'm honored to be able to welcome you to the Bob Alvarez Lifetime Achievement Party. On behalf of the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability and Nuclear Information and Research Service, I'm especially honored to welcome Bob to the party. I want to say just a couple of housekeeping things before we get underway, and it'll give time for some other people to join us. First, please introduce yourself in the chat and tell everybody how you know Bob. Second, if you're here by mistake, if you thought you were joining the 1960 Addams Family TV reunion party, this is not that party. I know it might look like it's that party, but it's not that party. That's next weekend. But since you're here, you might as well stay. You can learn about this amazing man we are honoring. In addition to the stories you're going to hear in just a minute, we've posted a number of really, really lovely stories that Bob has prepared, vignettes of his life, on the ANA website, which is ananuclear.org. And we're also inviting you to give Bob the kudos he deserves. Send him a message on the kudo board. Down at the bottom of your screen, there's a link that says write a message for Bob, and that will take you to the kudo board. There's also a link down there that says Zoom After Party. That's where we'll gather for a reception where we can all see each other and hear some more stories. Please don't go to the Zoom After Party now. There's nothing there. The bar isn't open. We're not putting out the food early. I think it's just the band doing a sound check. So don't go there yet. The last thing I want to say by introduction is to apologize to Bob. Bob, we thought it was a brilliant plan to give you a Lifetime Achievement Award. But as everybody is going to hear, and many of them already know, you have done more so far in your life than most of us could accomplish in 2 or 3 lifetimes. So we really should be giving you 2 or 3 Lifetime Achievement Awards, or maybe a Lifetime's Achievement Award. I'm sorry. We're doing the best we can, but we know it's really not sufficient. So those are the preliminaries. Welcome, everyone. Friends of Bob, fans of the Addams family. Let's get the party started at the very best place to start, the beginning. It all started in Youngstown, Ohio. And we...
Well, here I am. Here I am, the last guy between, I am the last one between you and the food. So, and my wife, Kitty, who some of you may know, cheekily asked me, well, what are you going to be speaking about, Bob? And I said, oh, about spent fuel from reactors. She said, oh, is this going to be a 4-day marathon? And I said, no, I think they might get it in 30 minutes. So anyway, as they say, put your trays in an upright position, fasten your seatbelts, and off we go.
And off we go. So we're going to tell Bob's stories in chapters, not necessarily chronological order. We pre-recorded the chapters along, as you just saw, with some bits from Bob. Chapter 1 features Tom Carpenter, Susan Gordon, and Richard Miller. And so we present to you the Senate years.
Hi, my name's Tom Carpenter, and I'm the executive director of Hanford Challenge. And I've been an activist on nuclear issues since 1978. And I'm here to talk about the amazing Bob Alvarez, who is receiving the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability. I knew about Bob before we met. I knew about his work, along with his incredible wife, Kitty Tucker, when they exposed the murder of Karen Silkwood. He wrote a book, Killing Our Own, which told the story of illnesses and injuries resulting from workers getting exposed to contaminants at the nation's nuclear bomb plants. The book had a really deep impact on me because I'd been helping workers as an activist from an Ohio nuclear plant called the Fernald facility. And these workers were definitely experiencing the excess cancers, lung disease, and heart problems that Bob was talking about in his book. So in my mind, before I even met him, Bob was a legend. But I really got to know Bob through his work as a senior staffer at Senator John Glenn's office. By that time, I was working with whistleblowers from Rocky Flats, Atomic Power, Knowles Atomic Power Labs, Los Alamos, Hanford, Pantex, and a few other sites. I quickly learned what a great resource he really was. And the relationship with something like this, I would conduct investigations at these sites and feed information to Bob. That information was credible because it came firsthand from people who worked at these sites. The working conditions they described were simply horrendous. Safety took a backseat to production, and these workers were simply expendable commodities. And so was the environment. So Bob used the information I fed to him to great effect. And he used it as fodder for congressional hearings, legislation, media exposure, in short, driving very effective policy change to transform this unaccountable Department of Energy, which was making nuclear weapons in secret behind the scenes, into a place that was going to be better run. At Pantex, where the government assembles and disassembles live nuclear warheads in Texas, Bob discovered that management had put an illiterate worker in charge of reading out instructions on taking apart a live nuclear weapon. A mistake could literally blow Amarillo, Texas off the map. I never would have heard the story, but for Bob. The inspector became an important whistleblower down the road. Bob has hundreds of stories like this one. Drinking a beer with Bob is both highly entertaining and equally horrifying. You wonder how we've made it this far as a so-called civilization. Bob's impact on the Hanford nuclear site, which is where I spend most of my time these days, and I consider it the biggest, baddest, most expensive nuclear boondoggle in the nation, really can't be overstated. Bob was a key driver behind assuring that all of Hanford's nuclear waste tanks would be emptied and contents vitrified or turned into glass. And Bob was the person behind implementing worker compensation packages for workers at Hanford and places like Hanford through the passage of a federal law called the EEOICPA. Bob did not name that act. Bob stood up for atomic veterans. He took up the cause of Marshall Islanders, whose home was literally bombed, and the Islanders moved back so that the government could study the effects of radioactive exposure on these innocent people. Bob wrote report after report exposing the DOE's criminal, environmental, and safety legacy. He spoke out at conferences and forums and was an important go-to source for the news media covering these stories. My favorite Bob story at Hanford involved my first major Hanford whistleblower case back in, I'd say 1988, involving Ed Bricker. Ed was a nuclear process operator at Hanford, and as a union steward, it was his job to confront management on safety lapses, and he did so, much to the mounting irritation of his managers, to whom he reported. But when Congress started investigating Hanford, Ed started talking to people like me and Bob Alvarez. Around this time, management had clearly decided to get rid of Ed. So managers directed the internal security apparatus at Hanford to get Ed Bricker. Now, to a lot of people, this might sound hyperbolic, but it isn't. Bob Alvarez proved that. It started when a friend of Ed's named Jack came over to Ed Bricker's house. His job was in trouble. Jack's job was in trouble. And he was told by security managers that he needed to report on Ed, become a spy, if he wanted to keep his job. DOE security agents demanded that Jack wear a hidden wire recording device to try to entrap Ed in conducting a business arrangement at work. This could be used as a pretext to fire Ed. Jack agreed to wear that wire, but then changed his mind and later told Ed all about it. Ed put Jack in touch with me. I was his lawyer, and we talked about it and cooked up a plan where Jack could obtain his security file, which revealed the written transcript where Jack was induced by security to wear a hidden wire. Bingo. I called and told an incredulous Bob Alvarez, who was working for Senator John Glenn as an investigator, this whole story. Bob was over the moon that we had an actual transcript of this, and he got on it immediately. Bob got the Inspector General to come to the Senate offices for a meeting. Bob was waiting. When the IG arrived, Bob put him in a small, overheated room and plied him with coffee and chit-chat. After some time had gone by, Bob asked, "Tell us about the illegal surveillance equipment that DOE is using against whistleblowers." The IG knew Bob well enough that he had something, so he just held out his hand, and Bob gave him the transcript of the Jack security interview. The Inspector General read it, handed it back to Bob, and Bob said, "Well, this is one of those situations where you're either part of the problem or part of the solution. Which is it going to be?" And of course, the IG said, "I'm on it." And he was. After a few months, the IG released a report detailing the stockpiling of millions of dollars of illegal surveillance technology, not only at Hanford, but at most other DOE sites as well. Bob arranged for a Senate hearing to be held. Time magazine ran a profile article. New York Times and Washington Post ate it up, and the brown stuff hit the fan. DOE was compelled to collect, catalog, and destroy millions of dollars worth of illegal surveillance technology. Security budgets were slashed by Congress. Bricker's case hit the courts and was quickly settled. And life was a little better for whistleblowers in the DOE complex everywhere. Bob is an amazing, intelligent, and caring human being who's had a lifelong mission of taking on the nuclear industry, both military and commercial, and winning battle after battle. He's been a fantastic partner for activists in the field like me and many others besides, and a friend to workers in so many ways. He defended tribal rights. Well, the list is huge. I'm damning him with faint praise. I have so many great stories about Bob, but I wanted to at least give a flavor of what a precious commodity we have with Bob's work, going back decades, revealing Hanford tank leaks to meltdowns at Savannah River, to unmasking the cancer clusters and nuke workers deliberately hidden for years. Bob is one of my best friends and among my most important partners. I never needed a place to stay when I visited Washington, D.C., because he always had a spare bed for me. He always called me back. He always made time to help me with our urgent needs, as busy as he was. And he was a reliable and consistent source of knowledge, wisdom, and compassion. He propped me up over and over again. Bob recently spent a year working with me on what turned out to be a much bigger report than we thought would happen on a waste treatment plant called Permafix outside of Hanford, which had a horrific history of accidents and overexposures. That report was published in November 2020, and I sent Bob a few $1,000 for what I am sure would have cost me $20,000 or $30,000 if I had hired other experts. But Bob didn't just undercharge me. He donated the money back, saying he had enough money. That story alone says it all. Thank you, Bob Alvarez, my personal hero, role model, and inspiring light. You deserve this award so much.
Hi, Bob. Hi, folks. I appreciate the opportunity to share some brief remembrances of working with Bob way back in 1997. Our organization at the time had the worst name for an environmental and peace organization, the Military Production Network. for Senator John Glenn of Ohio. Yes, that John Glenn, the astronaut. Bob was a science advisor and chief investigator to a government operations committee. And because he was an insider, he had information to access to information that he knew needed to get out. And he wanted to help grassroots communities gain useful and important information for our work challenging the nuclear weapons complex. Bob worked with Senator Glenn and NPN's media expert Bob Schaefer to release the information to the USA Today. Peter Eisler was our contact there. Cancers as a result of the above-ground nuclear weapons tests in the US. It had been suppressed for 14 years by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the National Cancer Institute. Through Bob's work and connections, we ended up with 7 front-page stories in USA Today. By forcing the information out, it had a huge impact on our understanding of health impacts from radiation fallout exposures. Additional studies followed, looking at the cumulative impacts from all of the above-ground nuclear tests around the world. And that information has really made a big difference in our overall understanding and looking at cumulative impacts to radiation exposure. Data is still available today on the National Cancer Institute's website, cancer.gov. You can go there and type in iodine 131. You can navigate to the display bar. You plug in your date of birth, where you lived during the time of the explosions, whether you drank cow's milk or goat's milk, and you'll get a calculation that can help you estimate your cancer risks. NPM gave an award to Senator John Glenn during our annual DC Day shortly after the release. Bob played a role in the Department of Energy with Secretary Hazel O'Leary's Openness Initiative and also under Energy Secretary Bill Richardson. He has an amazing amount of factual knowledge of the entire nuclear weapons complex and historical understanding of their programs. He has the ability to connect dots and explain it to local activists. And most of all, Bob knows how to use information to enable social change. Bob and his wife, Kitty Tucker, have been 2 of our strongest advocates over decades, exposing the ugly realities of the nuclear weapons and nuclear power industries and their many connections. We've relied on Bob in case after case for his insights and advice, and I know I am deeply grateful for Bob and Kitty for their guidance and support over many decades. So I want to share a little story about Bob. We went to a conference in St. Petersburg, Russia in, I think, 2006. And we stayed in an apartment close to the meeting location, and we drank some beer. Well, actually, we drank a lot of beer. And Bob, never letting an opportunity for creative thinking go to waste, lined up all the beer bottles on the counter and proceeded to tune them to a scale. Then he started playing music on these beer bottles. So it was a very funny moment. The other folks in our apartment were Jay Coughlin and my daughter, Lindsay Swanson. And we laughed and laughed. And it's a moment that I will never forget sharing with Bob. So I really hope those pictures made it into this presentation honoring Bob today. And you all get to share in that moment as well, because Bob is a genius on many levels, and having fun is part of his approach to life as well.
Hi, I'm Richard Miller, and the thread that connects me to Bob Alvarez is through Tony Mazzocchi, who served as a mentor during my 17-year tenure with the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union. And the thread that connected Tony Mazzocchi to Bob Alvarez and his beloved wife, Kitty, was the Karen Silkwood murder investigation, the congressional hearings, and the trial. Bob never forgot his working class roots as he moved from environmental advocacy to staffing Senator Glenn and later to his tenure at the Energy Department. And, you know, we all know how Bob, working for Senator Glenn, had exposed the hazards of the weapons complex and helped to form what is today's EM program. But he also did something that had a little less visibility. He steered legislation to ensure that site workers and their unions were not eliminated in the process of shifting missions, which not everybody in Congress or the DOE was fully committed to. But that work, along with building support for nuclear workers' medical surveillance and healthcare and compensation for radiation-related diseases, earned him street cred with many of the unions. Inside the DOE bureaucracy, I think it can be said that Bob did not bend to the whims and political expediencies that others expected, which put him on the list of appointees to be fired. Lacking the team player spirit, he was often frozen out of decision-making, such as when the Department of Energy was trying to sell radioactive metals into unrestricted commerce from the enrichment plants. That was a red line because it was advertised as a priority of then Vice President Gore. And then there was the time the general counsel, Marianne Sullivan, forbid Bob from communicating with me, since the union was constantly suing the Department of Energy. Many unions in the Department of Energy complex did not take kindly to the idea that Bob should be scrapped. So when Bill Richardson was making his whistle-stop tour following his confirmation as Secretary of Energy, he made sure to touch base with unions at every DOE site, and each time they asked him to keep Bob on the payroll. And Richardson often noted that he would have not won his first primary for election to Congress without the support of the steelworkers in his district. And when Bill Richardson visited Paducah, I recall a meeting with the secretary in a small anteroom at the Alban Barkley Regional Airport, where David Fuller, the local union president, pressed Mr. Richardson on retaining Bob. Richardson responded, "What's the deal with this Alvarez guy? Everywhere I go," he said, "unions were asking, why aren't you keeping him?" And he commented, looks like this guy might be a pretty good organizer. But he didn't make any commitments. Of course, as we know, Mr. Richardson did hire Bob. We was given a leash to protect unions. And working with David Michaels, he advanced legislation to compensate nuclear workers, a law that has since benefited tens of thousands of workers and their survivors. Holding true to his principles may have risked his job inside the headquarters of the bomb factory on more than one occasion, but it is also what helped him win his job back. Now, Bob and I have stayed connected through the thick and thin of his life's ups and downs, including a 15-year residency in his basement in Tacoma Park. He's a mentor, and for that, I am grateful.
Great stories. Thanks, Tom and Susan and Richard. I want to remind you to feel free to use the chat to talk to each other. We'll be saving it for Bob to enjoy when the party's over. Bob was one of the first, most credible and persistent voices to address the dangers of irradiated nuclear power and nuclear weapons materials, the dangers of the storage schemes, and the inadequacy of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And I think we have a couple of clips we're going to show here.
In the United States, we have spent fuel storage in buildings that you would find at big box stores and car dealerships. Once the water starts to drain, you have to understand that after a point at which the water drains, the radiation levels become so prohibitively large that they will actually prevent emergency crews from actually intervening, because then you're getting at lethal dose rates on the order of 500 per hour at maybe 50, 60, 70 yards. These pools do not have secondary containments. Some of these pools have buildings with tin roofs. As I said, some of these pool structures you would find the kind of structure you would expect to find at a Costco, a Walmart, or a Ford dealership. They do not require them to have redundant power. They do not require them to have separate independent water makeup capability. And only after the Fukushima accident did the Nuclear Regulatory Commission get around to requiring the reactor operators for the first time to have instrumentation in their control rooms to tell them water levels, water chemistry, and water temperature of the pools. Before that, people had to go and look in the room. And there was at least one occasion when they didn't do that for a while and discovered that the water level dropped dramatically, and there have been some problems. The fission gas pressure inside the cladding is 2 to 3 times higher. They are experiencing much greater hydriding of the spent fuel cladding itself. and the reactors, some certain types of reactors are experiencing rather large amounts of what's called grid-to-rod fretting from these high burnouts simply from rubbing on the grid. There's more debris that falls into these reactors. Are not pristine environments. They have debris, they have parts, they have bolts, things that fall in on them. They're churning away, they're vibrating away, and they will cause a lot of wear and tear on the cladding. We're talking about cladding, by the way, that is between 0.04 millimeters and 0.08 millimeters. What does that mean? Think about extra heavy-duty aluminum foil. That's how thick the cladding is surrounding the pellets.
So, Chapter 2, Radiation, Organizing, and Care in Silkwood. We're going to hear from Diane D'Arrigo, from Sarah Nelson and Danny Sheehan, and John Kavanaugh. These will be our storytellers.
I'm Diane D'Arrigo with Nuclear Information and Resource Service, or NIRS. We are co-sponsoring the Lifetime Achievement Award for Bob Alvarez. He and his wife, Kitty Tucker, deserve appreciation and recognition for decades of knowledge, support, and inspiration that she had and he continues to share with the public, workers, downwinders, legislators, and interveners against nuclear power, weapons, and waste. When I first started at NIRS, Bob and the father of health physics, Dr. Carl Z. Morgan, Kitty, and a few others encouraged me to take on the updating of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission's radiation standards, which were being weakened in a deceptive way. Bob, who had trained himself in radiation science, explained to me more clearly than anyone else how these updated, quote-unquote, updated standards allow more radiation in each unit of dose. So the legal allowable dose appears to be lower, but workers in the public can be exposed to more radiation. For 6 years, I organized on this and literally learned at Bob's knee as I read through his documents and heard his stories sitting on the floor of his office at the Environmental Policy Institute. The knowledge gained here led to building an effective coalition to overturn the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission policies on BRC, below regulatory concern, which would have allowed a quarter to a third of the U.S. nuclear power waste to go into regular trash and everyday recycling to make consumer goods. We stopped that at commercial reactors, and Bob took it on at the DOE. Although I wanted him to stop DOE from releasing all radioactive waste, materials, soil, concrete, wood, plastics, oil, metal, scrap, chemicals into commercial recycling and regular trash, Bob was only able to pull off stopping radioactive metal recycling. He got then Secretary Bill Richardson to prohibit release of any metal from DOE radiological areas. Pretty good considering DOE had been counting on getting paid for selling this waste into commerce. And now it must isolate it in perpetuity. DOE staff and contractors were pretty mad and continue to try to circumvent the policy that Bob got through. But the public and the metal industry are still grateful and wish we had someone like Bob in there now to make sure the ban is not being violated. Bob and Kitty educated the public and the media about our inadequate radiation protection, the industry and government schemes, the crooked radiation organizations on the national and international levels that cite each other to exclude the public and public understanding. When Chernobyl started melting down in 1986, and spreading radioactivity around the globe over and over, Bob and Kitty stepped right up, held a press conference, a national press conference clearly explaining the dangers of radiation, piercing the veils of secrecy, confusion, and deliberate misinformation. Their work and that of Dan Hirsch from the University of California at Santa Cruz and others led to the closure of the N reactor, nuclear weapons reactor at Hanford, and much of the U.S. nuclear weapons program. Kitty and Bob brought the world's experts in radiation together in DC, Doctors John Goffman, Carl Z. Morgan, Carl Johnson, Alice Stewart, Rosalie Bertell, Ernest Sternglass, and others to meet, collaborate, and educate. Bob brought many of them to testify to Congress to get it in the record and challenge the forces attempting to minimize radiation dangers. In these decades, Bob has been a huge force and a huge resource for those intervening legally, challenging dirty, dangerous, and expensive nuclear power reactors, license extensions, and new waste sites. He has served as an expert witness in dozens of cases. Every time I talk to Bob, I end up taking notes and asking for references for what he's telling me. And of course, you all know that Bob has already written it up in a published article or paper with complete references, which he can instantly locate and send. In the last couple of years, I have been lucky enough to occasionally join Bob to partake in two of his best skills, cooking Sunday night dinners, followed by Scrabble. Who else could serve up a delectable meal and delve into the details of the West Valley nuclear reprocessing site, the Santa Susana fires, the difference between millirems and millirems effective dose equivalent, changing the definition of transuranics from 10 to 100 nanocuries per gram while slaughtering me at Scrabble. Here's to you, Bob, and all of your terrific, tough work over the decades, and to continued victory as you help get the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act expanded and extended in the next few months. Love, cheer, kudos from NEARS and all of us fighting nuclear power, waste, and radiation battles everywhere.
Well, it's a joy to be invited to talk about the contributions that Bob Alvarez has made to the public interest, to the common good, and, to the really existential fight against the deadly nuclear industry. I mean, his contributions are really significant. And we met him back in the 1970s around the Karen Silkwood case. We formed an alliance with Kitty and Bob, and also with a whole lot of other people, to uncover what happened to Karen Silkwood, who contaminated her house with deadly plutonium, who ran her off the road and killed her, who took all her documents, which were exposing the fact that there was so much plutonium leaking from the plant and endangering the workers and the public, and that there was plutonium missing from the plant, enough to make a nuclear bomb or more. So it was a very serious situation, and she was delivering her evidence to a New York Times reporter when she was run off the road and killed. And so Kitty started a group called the Supporters of Silkwood in the anti-nuke movement. She approached me. I got involved as the chair of the labor committee nationally for the National Organization for Women. And later, Danny got involved as an attorney to help actually represent her family and her estate in a lawsuit against the Kerr-McGee Nuclear Corporation. Bob was doing something very strategic in this whole process. He was working at the Environmental Policy Center and Institute, and he was also working with Senator Alvarez and his office in the House and Senate of the United States. And we were committed to getting congressional hearings to look into and investigate what happened to Karen. And Bob was doing the inside strategy on the Hill, working with both House and Senate members to try to get them to support a national investigation and a congressional investigation. And Kitty was mobilizing and unifying the anti-nuke movement for the first time ever in its history. They agreed to begin to do annual events together all over the country simultaneously in honor of Karen Silkwood. And I was working with all the NOW chapters in the country to get pressure put onto the Congress to do the investigation, and also with the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union and the Interfaith Movement. And Danny, of course, was at the Jesuit office, so he was bringing in a tremendous amount of Catholic support when he came on board. So we were building this alliance. The ACLU joined. Ann Zill from Stuart Mott's Fund for Constitutional Government joined us, and we all formed the Karen Silkwood Fund, and went on to do, after we got the congressional investigations, and the hearings, went on to do the lawsuit and eventually a gigantic campaign throughout the country. And Karen became known as the first nuclear martyr, recognized as that, in the United States and Australia and Europe. Bob played always a completely strategic role. He not only was critical to the work that was going on directly with the senators and the Congress people, which resulted in two sets of hearings and exposure of very serious things that ended up being on the front page of the Time magazine. But he also had relationships with all the experts in the field in the nuclear field, who were aware of the difficulties in this industry and the difficulties with the government and their lack of proper oversight of this industry. So, and he brought in the environmental movement to this entire alliance and this entire campaign, which became a huge campaign throughout the country. But I want to ask Danny, I mean, didn't he also, he played a really important role in the litigation?
Bob was the actual nexus between the use of private nuclear power and the issue of nuclear weapons. He was instrumental in educating us to demonstrate that the origins of the private nuclear industry was in fact a covert operation on the part of the United States military to be able to continue the development of nuclear weapons to be used by the United States. Because immediately after World War II and the dropping of the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was a worldwide revulsion against this horrible weapon that was clearly designed to kill civilians by the millions. And it's a violation of the just war theory and the legitimate rules of war. And with all the complaining going on now about Russia, bombing civilians in Ukraine, Bob was clear in showing us that in the documents, he got access to the internal documents in the government showing that there was this conspiracy to try to maintain the development of nuclear weapons in the face of this huge upsurge in the world to stop it. And that they use the covert means of saying, oh, we're going to be able to use nuclear power to generate electricity. It'll be too cheap to meter. And this was a huge campaign, and they were never able to actually run these things safely. They were consistently contaminating the workers, the regions that they were built in, killing, huge fish. They would dump the water into the rivers and kill thousands of fish. And Bob knew all about this. That Bob was the most trusted person inside the government to interface with the anti-nuclear community of civilians. And he was the most important civilian in the midst of all of our organizers who could relate to the government. So he's worked as the nexus between the internal people inside the government who are concerned about both of these programs and the outside world. And Bob was instrumental, for example, when he's the one that provided the witnesses like Dr. Goffman, who was able to testify that not only was he adamantly opposed to the present standards that the NRC and the Kerr-McGee Nuclear Corporation were professedly adhering to as being completely inadequate to protect and safeguard the workers, he was able to testify that he was in fact the original author of the original standards. And he knew that they were killing the people. And so Bob was instrumental in this. And he also is the fellow who, when 3 Mile Island melted down, came into the courtroom and kind of whispered to me. I was sitting over at council table, and he got me to get up from council table and take me out into the hall and say, the 3 Mile Island facility in Pennsylvania is melting down right now. And it was right during the cross-examination of the person who built the nuclear power facility, or the nuclear reprocessing facility for Kerr-McGee. So we came back in because of Bob's knowledge about these things. We went back in and continued interrogating the guy on the stand about whether or not the Kerr-McGee nuclear facility was as safe as any other facility in the country. He said yes. And then we said, well, how about the 3 Mile Island facility in Pennsylvania? Is this facility as safe as that? And he said, oh, yes, they're both exactly the same in safety. And meanwhile, the place is melting down. And so Bob was the courier back and forth between the inside information from the government and the information that was being put out into the public interest. And of course, in addition to that, he was an absolutely dear friend and totally reliable guy that Sarah, who was running the whole operation from the National Organization for Women, lived in the house with Kitty and Bob. And I was over at Jesuit headquarters, and we engineered this interesting marriage between the National Organization for Women on the one hand and the Jesuit order on the other hand. And so the Christic Institute that rose up out of that was viewed in Washington, D.C. as the most responsible public interest group working with the religious community. And the religious community viewed us as the most important and reliable religious organization working with the public interest community. So that Bob was the example of how you do this, how you become beloved, in effect, of the very group that you're working with, even though you're working as liaison between two different groups. And that's the expertise that Bob had. And of course, he went on to also reveal the information about the damage that was done to the American service people who were ordered to stand out under a mushroom cloud in the bombing tests out in Nevada, who were getting cancer. He was personally responsible for getting the remuneration to the families of those people, the people who died of cancer. He was the most instrumental person inside the government in helping the victims of nuclear power and nuclear weapons in the history of the United States. So he's an absolutely extraordinary treasure to the American people, and so that we happen to love him personally, but the rest of the world owes him an extraordinary debt of gratitude. And he's still at it, of course. We aren't talking about him as though he's dead. This isn't an obituary. He's still very much alive, and we wanted to, love him and congratulate him while he's still young enough to enjoy it.
I just want to say one final thing. In addition to being this great, wonderful expert and hardworking servant of the public, the Lakota people have a saying that the most important thing that any of us are supposed to do on this planet, in this incarnation, any incarnation, is to be a good human being. And what I would say about Bob, he's one of the best human beings that I've ever met. And it's been an absolute blessing to be able to work with him and know him in this incarnation.
What a treat to join you all today in honoring Bob Alvarez. I'm John Cavanna, and I've had the pleasure to work with Bob for the last 25 years as a colleague at the Institute for Policy Studies. And on behalf of everyone at IPS, we are here to celebrate Bob Alvarez Day. I remember meeting Bob roughly a quarter century ago when Saul Landau first brought him into IPS. And I thought, this guy's perfect for us. The whole methodology of IPS is to work with communities and social movements that are fighting for justice and for social change. And that's what Bob did. He was great at going into communities hurt by nuclear waste and getting to know people and getting to know their issues and what they wanted and figuring out ways to help them. I'll never forget, soon after meeting Bob, I remember him explaining his brain as something akin to a large garage full of stuff. Bob claimed sort of randomly scattered, a messy garage, and he would pull different things off the shelf and toss out what he could that might be helpful. And as I got to know him more and more, I realized the analogy was good in one respect. His brain is like a large garage. It's full of fascinating stuff. But I found it to be exquisitely organized, an exquisitely organized garage where he knew to, and this is different than most of us, he knew how to sift through the junk and push it aside and find the nuggets of wisdom that would help people do something that most progressives don't do so well, which is win things that help people. Imagine somebody who helps get the radioactive waste left over or hidden from the Manhattan Project in St. Louis and get it removed. Imagine winning compensation for tens of thousands of uranium miners who were never told of the dangers of their work. These are real wins. And so I just want to say, and I can't think of any human being who in the midst of that work and all of that wisdom that he gained from his years of working in the nonprofit world with the Environmental Policy Institute, to the Senate, to the Department of Energy, to IPS and all of those communities in between. I can't think of another individual who's done more to educate the American public about the dangers of nuclear waste and be funny and do all sorts of other things in the meantime. So hooray, Bob, from IPS, we love you, and we look forward to your next chapter.
In 1998, Senator Domenici sought to cut 700 jobs from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's Enforcement Division, which is basically wiping it out, and had, I guess, what you would call a come to Jesus meeting with the then chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Shirley Jackson. He was supported by his colleagues in the House who were willing and able to completely dismantle their nuclear safety enforcement program. The NRC, Chairman Jackson, heard the message. And from that point on, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission became more of an enabler rather than a regulator, and pretty much dismantled the regulatory reforms that arose after the 3 Mile Island accident in 1979. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission became much more dependent on industry self-reporting. The reactors have these thick concrete and steel barriers, like domes or structures around the reactor vessel that serve as the sort of the final barrier that prevents the escape of the radioactivity if the other things fail. The pools have none of that. They are in structures that you would find at auto dealerships. They are not considered nuclear safety related equipment. In other words, if you have a blackout, a loss of off-site power, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission does not require the reactor operator to have backup diesel generators for the pool water.
Well, leave it to Bob to explain complicated things in a very clear and precise manner. He did it over and over and over again, as you've been hearing. That brings us to chapter 3, and we have asked Jim Werner to tell us about the Department of Energy days when Bob went into the belly of the beast. Jim is now the section manager at the Congressional Research Service, and he was a colleague on the 7th floor of the Forrestal building.
Hey, Bob, the fact that I've gained any weight, I'm going to blame on you because I don't get to ride my bike over to your house anymore. Now you've moved to Virginia. In the amount of time I've got, I've just wanted to recount one particular story that you remember that kind of makes the larger point that for everybody else, Bob is always Bob, no matter what hat he's been wearing. And Bob and I have worn a lot of hats over the years we've known each other, whether he was with Senator Glenn's office or the Department of Energy, or collaborating on the Westlake landfill. Bob and I have worked together wearing different hats. And you can always count on Bob just being Bob, no matter what. And that's a good thing, because one thing we learned is that some people change their colors once they pass into the Forrestal building. But the little story I wanted to tell about Bob being Bob, even when we were both working inside the Forrestal building during the Clinton administration, was about the 50th anniversary of the nuclear bomb. That we helped organize in 1995. And for those of you who don't know, as Beatrice Brailsford once said, working at DOE is sort of like parachuting every day in behind enemy lines and getting your driver's license renewed. And when we started in 93, it was a challenging environment to work in for anybody who hasn't worked in a large executive branch agency. Coming from then, I came just from NRDC, and Bob was with a very vital group with Senator Glenn's office. It was really right after the Berlin Wall fell, and things just got harder after the 1994 election when Newt Gingrich took over as Speaker of the House. And you may recall, we both got invited down the hall to a meeting in the Secretary's office to help plan for the 50th anniversary of the bomb. That was exploded initially, the plutonium device at Trinity in 1945, without public health measures and without adequate monitoring, of course, back then. The meeting was chaired by Charlie Curtis, who was then the Deputy Secretary. And you and I both worked at the same end of the building. And many people know that the Forrestal building is 2 blocks long. So it's a long walk we made together. And during that time, Bob grumbled in a way only Bob can grumble. I think helps him think out loud, sometimes grumbling about this gosh darn meeting, how stupid he thought it was. And along the way, we talked together about the plan, because the idea going in was that we were going to celebrate the Trinity detonation like it was a great antiseptic scientific development, and had all these spin-offs, sort of like Tang orange juice from the Apollo program. When we got to the meeting, that was exactly what the plan was. It was going to be a celebration of the bomb, like it was Ready Kilowatt, Your Friend the Atom, the Peaceful Atom, all of that. And Bob, that's classic for what you always bring to the table. That is, you have this ability, like a nuclear samurai walking into the battle, and able to put your finger right on the essence of the problem and speak truth to power. So we went around the table, and we both expressed our concerns about this kind of celebration of the atom. Long story short, the final outcome was not a celebration of the atom. It was not criticizing the atom either, because that's, of course, the mission of the Department of Energy, is to produce nuclear warheads. What we ended up with was an event at the National Academy of Sciences. And you recall Marvin Kalb from CBS News hosted it, and we came up with a list of people to speak. And the two in particular who we debated was Harold Agnew, who had been director of LANL, and of course, Edward Teller. And I particularly wanted Edward Teller because I knew Edward Teller would be Edward Teller, and people would make their own decisions. And soon before that, the Washington Post had just featured Dan Riker, who had confessed that his favorite movie was Dr. Strangelove. So for many people, that was foremost in their minds, and they would be able to make that comparison when Edward Teller spoke. But when the event came, one of the questions we had Marvin Kalb ask was, what would you most like people to take away from the development of nuclear weapons? And Harold Agnew used his opportunity to say, the most important thing I want people to realize right now is that you don't need weapons-grade plutonium. You can make a perfectly effective nuclear warhead out of reactor-grade plutonium. That may seem like a small technical thing, but putting that forth in that place at that time in front of Secretary O'Leary allowed us to go forward with the report we're then working on, Plutonium, the First 50 Years, that got published just a few months later in early 1996. And it was very controversial at the time about whether or not we were going to admit that reactor-grade plutonium could make an effective warhead. So organizing all that and working all that those issues and getting that event put together with Bob, it allowed us to get that statement out there publicly, which had been somewhat classified and somewhat controversial until then. And now I think it's better known. In any event, over the years, Bob, it's been great to have a partner working on this. I look forward to continuing anything we can continue to do. And I know that, as strong as you were, that if you ever fell short, if you came home, Kitty would give you a hard time. And I know she was a great partner for many years that kept you going as a great partner on it. So I hope you're okay on the other side of the Potomac. And I, again, miss having an excuse to ride my bike over to your house in Tacoma Park. And if you ever want to grumble about it and think about things anymore, I hope you'll be giving me a call soon. Take care, Bob. Talk to you soon.
When I was in the Energy Department, we looked at a spent fuel pool problem at the Hanford site, and that had been ignored for decades. And at the closeout briefing, we asked, well, what would happen if there was an earthquake and the water drained and there was a hem and a haw and hem and a haw? And finally, some old-timer basically said, well, there would be a fire that would make Chernobyl look like a pimple on a pumpkin. Irradiated fuel. This is what a spent fuel element looks like. It's extremely radioactive, as some of you all know. Being anywhere near this, you'll receive a lethal dose. These materials are radiotoxic. We've heard a lot of explanation about what that means. But I think there is official recognition by the United States government itself through the Government Accountability Office, who considers spent nuclear fuel to be considered one of the most hazardous substances on the earth. And what I want to talk about is essentially the environment, safety, and health burden which has been imposed upon us, that we have to start taking seriously from this detritus. As a recovering bureaucrat of the Department of Energy, I'm familiar with operating in parallel universes. In 2003, several colleagues and I were stricken from the Christmas card lists of a lot of people in the nuclear industry. When we published a paper basically raising the concern about the vulnerabilities of spent fuel pools, particularly to acts of terror and other events.
Where does it all go? All the waste and all the detritus from the nuclear industry. That's the next chapter of the story, really. We couldn't talk about Bob's life without talking about the Westlake landfill. Dawn Chapman of Just Moms is here to tell us about Bob's role in that saga.
Hi, Bob. How are you doing? It's good to see you. I just wanted to take a few moments here and recognize you and thank you for Hi, Bob. How are you doing? It's good to see you. I just wanted to take a few moments here and recognize you and thank you for everything that you have done and continue to do for our community living near the Westlake landfill. You know, I think from our first phone call, it was clear that you understood more than most the pain and the fear that we were going through here. And I think you also understood the struggle that we had with having radioactive waste from the Manhattan Project and the historical legacy and the impact that that was going to have on our fights and our ability to keep our families safe and our community safe and put it back whole. And your honesty and your advocacy from the get-go was what gave us the strength to continue fighting almost 10 years later. Your ability to teach us about what was going on and to help us learn how to read documents for ourselves and to understand the science and chemistry behind the radioactive waste that was poisoning our community is what allowed us to take control and then use our own voices to advocate for change within our particular situation. I remember the first meeting where you came out to the community. We had almost 700 people and show up, and I remember you introducing us to Kitty, your wife, and we were so nervous because this was when everyone, including the elected officials, were going to finally understand and grasp what had been allowed to happen here in our community for decades. And the way that you spoke to the press and the way that you spoke to the elected officials helped teach us how to carry on those conversations and how to advocate not just in front of our own community and our citizens, but in front of federal legislators. We took that knowledge and that experience with us when we went to Washington, D.C., and pushed the Environmental Protection Agency to come out with a cleanup plan for the Westlake landfill. So just about everything that we know and we've used came from you. And it came from Kitty as well. I remember Kitty taking us aside that night and just, you know, we were so scared and nervous, and the meeting was about to begin, and she just gave us the biggest hug and told us about her experience and what it's like before a meeting and then what it's like after. And, you know, you both were so open about the emotions that we would feel, the anger, and then the hurt, and how it would just be a circle, and you know how each day would be different, and it was hard to know, you know, what emotion was going to present itself when. And that the truth is that all of them are valid, and all of them are something that we shouldn't be ashamed of. You know, this has happened to us. We are the victims. So again, we're just so grateful to all that you continue to do and the help that you give all the other communities. And we want to congratulate you. And, you know, here's to many more years of advocacy, and here's to helping other communities become more safe and healthy. Thanks, Bob.
Chapter 5, for those keeping count at home, features Arjun Makajani, who's a longtime colleague and friend of Bob's. I think we may have a clip from Bob, a short one, before we get to Arjun.
They were afraid that the public would become so frightened and angry with what they were doing, and that because of the fact that people were being exposed without their knowledge and consent, things like that, that this would interfere with their ability to amass nuclear weapons.
I'm so glad that Bob Alvarez is getting this Lifetime Achievement Award. He has a lifetime full of amazing achievements. A great deal of his work is in the tradition, in the great tradition of science in the public interest, in the nuclear field that was started in the 1950s by Barry Commoner and his colleagues, who measured strontium-90 in babies' teeth arising from fallout from atmospheric testing, which ultimately led to the ban on atmospheric testing in 1963. Bob and Kitty Tucker did the same for nuclear weapons production and nuclear materials, starting with Kitty's dogged pursuit of the Karen Silkwood case, which of course became very famous with the movie and the lawsuit, which wound up all the way in the Supreme Court. I first met Kitty in 1979, actually, when I called her about a nuclear disarmament demonstration. I was very alarmed at the time that there were bumper stickers that said "Nuke Iran," and I thought the public really doesn't understand about nuclear weapons. And Bob's insight about that had been that the American public had what he called the romance with the atom. Which meant that so many people believed that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war and saved their lives of their brothers or fathers or husbands. And whether it had a solid connection with the facts or not, there was a cultural romance with the atom arising out of the relief of the end of the war. And so that particular belief had led to, support of the nuclear enterprise in those days, to the exclusion of understanding the dangers of nuclear weapons. And the great work that Bob did, including and Kitty in the 1970s, was to call attention to the fact that nuclear weapon states like the United States were hurting their own people in the course of nuclear weapons production and testing. Bob is, as many people know, is one of the authors of a book called Killing Our Own, which has a startling title, but which is also very accurate. And not that book is about the United States, but actually work that we did, me and my colleagues in the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, indicated that every nuclear weapon state has harmed its own people in the name of national security. And the boldness of Bob's work and the work of Bob's co-authors on that book was that early on and first, before anybody else, to my knowledge, other than the scientists in the 1950s, pointed out that nuclear weapon states were hurting their own people. And they were really doing it without properly informing them or taking their consent, saying this is needed for national security, and here's why, and here's the problem we're going to solve, and this is the risk we're going to impose on you. Bob's insights were really very important to the closure of so many nuclear weapons facilities at the end of the Cold War. For example, and to the compensation programs that were initiated in the 1980s and then on into the 1990s. He connected me, for instance, and David Albright, with Anthony Guarisco, an atomic veteran from the 1946 tests at Bikini. And our report was presented to Congress by Carl Morgan, who was one of the founders of the discipline of health physics in World War II, and was very material to the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which also included downwinders. Bob really brought many scientists, including me, into work on working with those who are suffering from nuclear weapons production today. In fact, he explicitly asked me that, Arjun, you have a PhD in nuclear fusion. Why aren't you helping people who are suffering and dying from nuclear weapons production today? It was a very compelling question. I had no good answer, so I began to work with him to help people who were suffering and dying from nuclear weapons and testing. And I continue that work, and Bob continues that work. Bob and Kitty, of course, one of Kitty's last research project before she passed was to compile the data on infant mortality right after the first nuclear weapons tests. She had been trying to do that for a long time, and Bob brought that project to fruition by an article in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. So he continues that dogged work to call attention to the problem of people who are suffering from nuclear weapons production and testing. He has an impeccable sense of timing. So in the early 1980s, when President Reagan wanted to open a plutonium separation plant, commercial plutonium separation plant, he said, Arjun, will you do a study evaluating commercial plutonium processing? And I said, sure, and point out its risks. And indeed, there are pretty serious risks and high costs that were not very known to the public. And when I was done, he said, take it to the Washington Post. I said, the Washington Post is not going to be interested. He said, I'm asking you to take it to the Washington Post. So I did. They ran an article, quite prominent. It became a huge scandal. And the core of the timing was that report came out during the British-Argentina War over the Falklands, Malvinas. And the Washington Post didn't think that plutonium separation was a very good idea because it could bring nuclear war into the Western Hemisphere. In recent years, of course, Bob has been in the leadership and in the forefront of calling attention to the problems of spent fuel storage, the highly radioactive used fuel that is stored in giant pools at nuclear power plants. And in the United States, they're densely packed, and loss of coolant would lead to fires and potentially lead to fires and catastrophic releases of radioactivity. He has painstakingly compiled the data at all nuclear power plants that has been used. I've certainly used it, and that has been used by people who are concerned about this issue. Brought other scientists into publications on this question. And his work really has been useful to millions, other than the practical achievement also of bringing relief and compensation and helping shut down nuclear weapons plants. One of his great accomplishments in the late 80s and early 90s was to call attention to the problem of the risks and dangers of explosions in the highly radioactive waste tanks at Hanford. This was when he was at the Government Affairs Committee in the Senate, a staffer at the Senate Government Affairs Committee. He was really in the forefront of calling attention to that problem. Bob really deserves this Lifetime Achievement Award, and I'm so glad that he's being honored in this way. And I'm happy to be able to contribute with some vignettes and memories of our work together, and I hope that work will continue. Thank you.
Wow, great to hear so many wonderful recollections. I want to say thanks to everybody who contributed to all of these recollections. I also want to thank the committee that worked so hard to put this program together for us to enjoy today. Liz Matson, Diane D'Arrigo, Kevin Camps, and Tom Carpenter did an astonishing amount of work putting this together, making it possible for all of us to give Bob these accolades that he so richly deserves. So thank you, planning team. And now Denise Duffield, who is the president of the board of the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability, is going to make the presentation of the award on behalf of ANA and NEARS, after which we'll hear a brief word from Bob, and then Diane D'Arrigo will read Bob's acceptance statement.
Thank you for coming today to celebrate Bob. On behalf of the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability and Nuclear Information and Resource Service, we present the Lifetime Achievement Award to Bob Alvarez with great respect, profound appreciation, and deep affection for defending people and the planet against the nuclear beast from the grassroots to the halls of power with calm, humor, humility, brilliance, and tireless determination.
Oh, thank you. I'm saving my voice because I'm going to try out with the New York Metropolitan Opera. So I'm going to have Diane read my statement for me.
Statement of Bob Alvarez, March 19th, 2022. I wish to thank Tom Carpenter, Liz Mattson, and the folks at Hanford Challenge, Diane Dorigo and the folks at Nuclear Information and Resource Service, Kevin Camps and Ralph Hutchinson, Denise Duffield, and all the folks at the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability for putting this event on. I am grateful to be honored by my friends and colleagues who have dedicated their lives to this struggle to protect our environment, safety, and health. In mid-September 1973, as I was getting ready for the long drive from Eugene, Oregon to Washington, D.C. to join Kitty, a friend pulled me aside and ominously said that highly radioactive wastes were leaking from giant tanks at Hanford in eastern Washington, threatening the Columbia River. And looking back after all these years, my friend's farewell warning was a harbinger shaping my career as an environmental activist. Over the years, we found ourselves in the midst of an unfolding struggle of coming to terms with the legacy of the nuclear arms race. At the heart of this struggle was a growing realization of the enormous environmental, safety, and health consequences and the historical decisions made that allowed them to occur. It became clear by the late 1970s that the pursuit of nuclear weapons put countless people into harm's way and severely polluted parts of the planet. The public was unaware of the magnitude of the environmental mess created over the decades at nuclear weapons sites, shrouded in secrecy. We were determined to shine a light on these bomb plants, especially as a major nuclear arms buildup was on the horizon. In doing so, we were able to actively participate in changing the paradigm of growth, defining the nuclear age, to one of custodianship, transcending the epic, defining the presence of human beings. It's a terrible responsibility we now face as the romance with the atom fades. You might describe my career as one of throwing spears and catching them, some of which I threw. Years spent as an environmental activist provided me with technical writing and organizing skills that have served me well over these years, especially while working in the US Senate and having to catch the spears in the Department of Energy. Even more important are the friendships I forged over these years. Many were kind and generous enough to mentor me in an array of subjects necessary to grasp the science and politics of the nuclear age. In many respects, I have had the privilege of standing on the shoulders of giants. I've always found it difficult to end pieces I've written. This time is no different, so I choose not to end the story. Instead, I offer my grateful thanks as we continue to seek justice for those sent into harm's way and to protect future generations.
Well, Bob, I think if we could hear the live Zoom, we'd be hearing a lot of applause right now. Not the least of which for that wonderful mustache. She's just like a carbon copy of you.
Yeah, it's like Gomez Adams.
Exactly right. So this brings this part of our celebration to a close. Thank you, everybody, for being part of this part of the afternoon. Thank you, Bob, for making it all possible by living such a wonderful life to this point and for putting up with all of this. Before we head to the after party, I want to remind you that you can read Bob's really remarkable vignettes and see his full CV and post your own stories, pictures, videos, sentiments on the Kudo board. All of these things will be preserved for Bob to see afterwards. And down at the bottom of your screen is a place where it says write a message to Bob, takes you to the Kudo board. We'll also put these links in the chat when we get to the Zoom after party, so don't panic if you don't catch them right here. And that is where we're headed now, to the Zoom after party. So we'll all be able finally to see each other. There's a button at the bottom of the screen. Now's the time to push that button. We've worked to make it one click easy. So see you in Zoom land.